Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on coalition building on youth homelessness. I can see on my list that there's loads of people joining the attendee section. We're just going to wait another moment or two before we get started. So just bear with us a moment. I'm sure most of you have probably been on Zoom plenty of times before now. But just to let you know that if you have any questions, you can put them in the questions and answers box during the two presentations that we have. So we're going to start today. I'm going to do a quick run through an introduction to this topic and talk a little bit about FEANTSA very briefly, but the majority of the time will be spent between Anne and Sabrina, who will be talking about coalition building for youth homelessness in Belgium and in Scotland. And we'll do questions and answers towards the end of their presentations. So please feel free to use the questions and answers box. I'll be keeping an eye on if you have specific questions for either presenter, mention it in the box. Otherwise, we'll keep them to the end. And usually what we do at that point is we'll have I'll pool the questions together and we can kind of have a conversation between the three of us on what's happening at the moment. So I'm just going to give us another moment or two. And we'll get started then in a second. Okay, hello everybody and welcome to our webinar today. We are here to discuss coalition building to end youth homelessness. My name is Robbie Steichlum. I work with FEANTSA and I lead on our work on youth homelessness. I'm joined today by Anne Rommel, who's going to be speaking about coalition building in Belgium, specifically in Flanders and Antwerp. And then we'll later be joined by Sabrina, who will talk about her experience with coalition building with the Way Home Scotland. Works for the Rock Trust. Before I hand over to our two presenters today, a quick reminder I mentioned at the very beginning, if you've got questions for either speaker, please feel free to add them into the questions and answers box. We'll be pooling them together and answering whatever questions you might have towards the end of the webinar. We have some time for a discussion. And otherwise, before we get started, I just want to remind anyone who has joined us today that in the last year, FEANTSA has changed our membership structures. And so previously, to be a member, you have to be a homeless service provider operating at a national level. That's no longer the case. We've changed our membership structures now, so it's a much broader coalition of organizations. So it's not just homeless service providers at national level, it can be at local or regional, it can be cities, agencies, ministries, foundations, think tanks, some actors from the public health sphere have also joined us, but as part of our broader ambitions in preventing and ending homelessness, that we can't do it ourselves as homeless service providers, we need the buy-in and support of other organizations. To be honest, it's probably never been a better time to join FEANTSA and our network. In 2021, the European Commission will launch a platform on homelessness. The established goal of this platform is going to be ending homelessness in Europe. There'll be lots of support made available to the member states to work towards this goal by 2030. They'll be monitoring homelessness, they'll be doing capacity building for EU funds, and there'll be the development of integrated strategies at a national level to combat homelessness, and transitional exchanges, and facilitating mutual learning. And in addition to those benefits, as a member of FEANTSA, you continue to feed into our policy development, identifying what are key topics you would like us to work on as an organization, work within our thematic clusters, when COVID is over, return to international best practices, doing site visits, going to different European countries to understand, not just from service providers, but also from policymakers, what works best when it comes to combating and ending homelessness in Europe. So after that very brief pitch, I'm going to hand over now to Anne, who is going to present on a way home in Belgium, but I have her slides. So Anne, you let me know if you can see everything okay?
I see them, yes.
Okay, perfect. Over to you.
Okay, thanks, Robbie. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for this interest, for your interest in this webinar. Also, thank you, Robbie, for the invitation to tell you something about what we do in Flanders and Brussels on local away home coalitions that cooperate to end and prevent youth homelessness. Next slide, please, Robbie. So just first, very briefly, I want to tell you who I am, who we are. So I work at the national or the Flemish government agency Opgroeien. Growing up is the translation. We are a rather new agency. We exist since 2019. When a lot of competences were merged into one agency in order to develop policies that are better for children, young people, and families in vulnerable situations. Our agency is responsible for preventive family support, childcare, foster care, adoption, youth care, and support of juvenile delinquents. And it's a very clear choice of this new government agency to apply an integrated and multidisciplinary approach in cooperation with a large number of partners. For youth care, this, for example, means that we do not want to organize youth care anymore somewhere separate of society, but that we want to bring it into society so that there is not a large gap between our young people and this society. And of course, also the choice to work with coalitions, away home coalitions, fits with this integrated and multidisciplinary approach. Next slide, please. What is also important to say is that our agency in the youth care policy puts an important focus on young adults. With this we mean the age of 16 till 25, because we see or we saw that we do not prepare and support them enough in the vulnerable phase of transition out of care. We saw, for example, that a too high number of young care leavers, for example, fall into youth homelessness. So we really had to undertake action. So we launched an action plan for young adults with different items. But one important one was to make youth care accessible till 25. So it was an extension from 21 till 25, which was a very important decision. We launched innovative care offers as co-housing projects. And also very important in collaboration with our partners that are providing youth care. We want that they prepare the transition out of care very early together with the young person, and also together with a lot of other stakeholders active in domains as housing, employment, education, leisure, maybe also adult care if this would be necessary. But very soon we saw that this collaboration on a case level is not enough. We needed also a structural collaboration between all these life domains in order to guarantee to our youngsters that they do not fall in extreme vulnerable situations, and that they also have access to sustainable housing, education, income, and so on. And in order to start the structural collaboration, we found inspiration in the Away Home movement in Canada. It is a movement that was started, a national coalition who wants to end and prevent youth homelessness. So they want to reimagine solutions to youth homelessness to transformations in policy, planning and practice. This Away Home Canada movement was a very important inspiration for us, and we started to experiment pilot with this in Antwerp in 2018. Mind the Gap started a new Away Home movement in Antwerp, and for which we found in Away Home Canada a huge source of inspiration. If you go to the website of Away Home Canada, you find a lot of inspiration how to start this coalition in your community. But for this presentation, I want to point out two frameworks that were important for us in Antwerp. Can you go to the next slide, Robbie? So I think this framework is probably known to the most of you. It is the collective impact framework. And for the Mind the Gap group in Antwerp, this framework was a big motor for change, I would say, with a focus on the process. So how do you create a coalition, a collaboration between a lot of stakeholders that are active in a lot of different domain sectors? How do you create a collaboration with a real impact that really change something in the life of these young people, and that really at the end also makes a big shift to end youth homelessness? So this framework says that you have to make 6 shifts. So from specialized agendas in each organization, you need one common agenda, one common strong goal, and also a shared inspiration in your community to reach that goal. From independent activities, we need mutually reinforcing activities or activities with a high leverage, and also activities with a focus on a change in the system. And once you then have launched these activities, set up a system of shared measurements instead of fragmented measurements, and also a plan of strategic learning in your coalition. If you launch an action, you measure it, what comes out of it, what do we have to do different in this coalition. What is also very important is that instead of communicating with each other once in a while, that there is this continuous communication, and that can also lead to a community engagement that is authentic and that is broad, and that you have more and more stakeholders that want to put their shoulders under your common agenda. And what was also very important for the success of the Away Home movement in Antwerp was that there is a backbone infrastructure, so a few persons that collaborate together to support the coalition in making these 6 shifts, and also push the coalition partners that change is necessary. You can go to the next slide, Robbie. So we had this collective impact framework that was a motor for change with focus on organization, on process. But what we really also needed in Antwerp was a motor for change with a focus on the content, because it is one thing to launch a coalition, to bring partners together, to develop a common goal and to engage yourself for this goal. But then how do you start with this? What kind of actions do you have to undertake? In which framework you can work? And for us, the roadmap for the prevention of youth homelessness was a very important part of the inspiration. If you click on the link, you will come on the title. You will see all the information that was gathered by Away Home Canada, a lot, also an extended report. I put it here, the roadmap that we have made in Mind the Gap in Antwerp. So it is in Dutch, but I will try to tell what is on the slide. So for us, this is a bit our roadmap, our framework in which we organize the actions that we want to undertake. At the right of the slide, you see the duty to assist. This is a very important driver in the Away Home movement. Youth homelessness is a violation of human rights, and as a community we all have the duty to do something about it. And yeah, it is almost obvious, but this is a very important driver to engage very different organizations, very different stakeholders. Once you have engaged with different stakeholders, they have to develop together actions in a lot of different pillars that were also presented by Away Home Canada. In order to end youth homelessness, you need to strengthen structural prevention. This means, for example, that you undertake actions to combat discrimination, that there is sufficient housing in a community. We also have to make sure that the systems, they work well. For example, there is continuity in care, that services are accessible so our young people do not fall through cracks. We also have to make sure that we invest enough in early intervention and detection, so that, for example, in collaboration with schools, with youth work, leisure organizations, that we also collaborate with them enough to see if there is a risk. If a young person, for example, if you see that that young person cannot sleep at home, that there is also a strong network that then can be, how can I say, called to help that young person. Also very important is to avoid and to end eviction, so that we avoid that people under 25 are not put out of their house anymore, and that we also create stable housing, for example, through Housing First for Youth projects. Next slide, please, Robbie. So we have seen that the creation of this coalition in Antwerp with a lot of different stakeholders. For the moment, we have 45 organizations engaged from all these different sectors: social housing, youth and adult care, education, local government. That the collective impact framework, the roadmap to end youth homelessness, has really helped us to organize our work in 4 action groups. So we have 4 action groups for the moment: living, networking, continuity of care, and early detection and intervention. Living, I mean housing. That's maybe a better English term. These action groups, so they are all responsible for several actions, and in these actions groups, it is a very dynamic group. They make sure that we do not only talk, but really concretize and evaluate the actions that we want to fulfill. This community engagement, the communication between all the members, we ensure to bring everyone together 3 times a year in a collective, so that the whole coalition sees each other. There is one back office that wants to, the backbone structure in Antwerp we call the back office. And for the moment we have 12 running actions. For example, we have created the walk in-house. We have a project that ensures access to social housing for youth at high risk, and we ensure the access to the social housing by guaranteeing also a good guidance from care. We have created a shelter for young people, but with a very active case management, that when young people arrive there, that they are also very quickly into a trajectory for support for housing. So there are several actions that are running. There are 19 actions in our action plan, but next week we come together again with the collective, and we will look to this action plan. Do we have to develop new actions also with the new world with COVID-19, maybe we also have to redevelop new actions. So we will see how, together with everyone, how we continue. I think what is in Antwerp a big challenge is to the impact. How do you put this how do you make the evaluation of your actions with all these organizations together? So I'm also very curious to the story of Sabrina after my presentation to see if we can be helped by their experiences. Next slide, please, Robbie. So we are very happy with what happened in Antwerp, and what we want to do is to start 9 new local away home coalitions. So for the moment we do not talk about a national away home coalition. We see it more on a local level in a city, or a collaboration between some municipalities to create there this strong coalition, this strong collaboration between these different actors. So we asked to the different regions if they had a look in their context, which would be the cities that they would like that there exists a away home coalition. Where is there a need for an away home coalition? So these are, it are most of the time cities, Oostende, Kortrijk, Ghent, Leuven, Brussels, Mechelen, and Sint-Truiden, the Kempen and Noord-Limburg, or then more regions. I cannot tell you much about results because this is all starting now. What we want to do is, as a starting point, that there is this backbone support, sort of planning team, a back office, who will start this local away home coalition. In all of the pilot regions, in the most of them, we have already a back office that exists out of also very different kind of stakeholders. It can be a youth, someone of a youth care institution, someone of a shelter, someone of a low threshold service. So they are really diverse, these back offices. And what we want to do from the agency growing up is to start a sort of support trajectory, because it is quite hard and complex work to start such a coalition in collaboration with the university college. And in this support trajectory, we will offer training, individual coaching, and also start learning networks focusing on youth participation, because the voice of youth should be central in this away home coalition. But how do you do this? Which models exist for that? And so on. We will also support them in creating a strong local support, and on how to build bridges with diverse stakeholders. So this is a support trajectory that will take 18 months. And then we also we actually wanted to finance it with European subventions. Unfortunately, we didn't succeed in to have a European project, but we also want to reach out a bit to the other away home coalitions that are existing in Europe, in Scotland, in Denmark, Wales, and to see if we can also get their inspiration on which solutions to youth homeless they put in place that have proven their effectiveness, and that we could also bring to our new away home coalitions in these different cities. So this was my story. I think so thanks for your attention. I think I was maybe a bit short, but please do not hesitate to ask your questions if you want that I elaborate something more.
Thanks very much, Anne. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going to hand over to Sabrina now. You can bring up your presentation. And again, if anybody has questions, please feel free to put them into the questions and answers box. And towards the end of the presentation from Sabrina, I'll put them together and we can have a conversation about key issues or topics that have come up. So I guess the idea between the two presentations today was the Belgian example is kind of what we might call a newer, although actually it's quite established now, but it is quite a newer coalition to end youth homelessness. And the Away Home Scotland approach is a little bit older, maybe a bit more kind of mature in its experience. And so we thought it would be very interesting for Anne to have shown a bit more on how did you set it up and some of the kind of the structural parts of building a coalition, and then for Sabrina to be able to discuss what are some of the results from a project that has been running a little bit longer. So Sabrina.
Okay, can you?
I can hear you perfectly.
Me? Yes. If I do like this, can you still see the presentation?
Mm-hmm.
Yep, perfect. Okay, so I think it was really interesting hearing from Anne, just because it reminds me of what we had to do a couple of years ago. And it is true, it's very challenging. It's very hard to get people around that shared goal, as Anne mentioned. So I am the policy coordinator of Away Home Scotland. And I would like to share a little bit of the concrete value that I think Away Home has added to the fight to youth homelessness here in Scotland. So before I explain some practical things that we have achieved in the past few years, I just wanted to highlight the fact that we exist to end youth homelessness here. And to do that, we just really want to encourage everyone who's involved in the lives of young people. So we're talking housing, families, educations, youth work, hospitals, to just really know what to do in case a young person is at risk or is already experiencing homelessness. So I think one of the most important things that we've done was really try to find these unusual suspects. When we talk about homelessness and when we talk about youth homelessness, normally people just engage with other homelessness charities and housing associations, landlords, and similars. And because we know that homelessness is not a housing issue, we need to have broader support from the schools, from hospitals, from doctors, from anyone who really works with young people on a daily basis. So here you can see some of our partners, and we are lucky enough to be working with amazing third sector organizations and to have the Scottish Government on board. And I think here, I just wanted to highlight on the left-hand side, you can see a logo that says After Streets. This is our National Youth Steering Group. I think it's quite important for people to know that we just really want to work with young people and we want them to be equal partners. This is extremely challenging to achieve because we are not used to include young people. We are not used to do that in a non-tokenistic way. And so it's really, really, really hard. And especially for us to work together with all these partners, we have to stop working in silos. And I'm sure it happens in many European countries, but definitely in Scotland, building a coalition, it's hard because there's so much competition in the third sector that we don't really want to align our strategies and have a common goal. So that's the struggle that we've encountered at the beginning. But we have been lucky enough, and I think we've been also very persistent in putting together this group of organizations and of course putting young people right at the center. So as Anne said, we need to have a common goal. Now we work in the sector. We know that youth homelessness, it's a massive issue. Unfortunately, when I go and do presentations, when I do workshops, people have an idea that it's bad, but the majority of people don't really understand how bad it is. So that's why I think it's really important that we always remind people of the situation of the facts, of the stats, because that's why we want to work on this. And again, it goes back to having this common goal. Whenever we want to do something new, whenever we ask policy or legislation to change, we have to go back to this and basically explain that here in Scotland, we don't have the latest statistics, but for 2018, 2019, almost 7,000 people, young people, presented as homeless. And that's quite a bad statistic, because it's 25% of the whole homeless population here in Scotland, but young people represent just 11% of the nation's total population. So they're hugely overrepresented within the homeless community. And that's why we need to work on that. That's why we need all organizations to be on board and tackle this issue with us. And of course, as you can see, 3 main causes make up 70% of the cases. So 40% of young people were asked to leave, and then 19 and 11% had either a violent or non-violent dispute within the household. So that's the situation here in Scotland. And because we have this experience, I would say, and because we have built this coalition and we have set up a common goal, which is to end youth homelessness, we felt that we were in a position to ask the HPSG, which is the Homelessness Prevention and Strategy Group, to have a seat at their table. To give you a bit of background information, a couple of years ago, a group of people and organizations called HARSAG, Homelessness and Rough Sleeping Action Group, presented a set of recommendations to the Scottish Government. The Scottish Government then adopted and accepted those recommendations and turned them into the Ending Homelessness High-Level Action Plan. And this HPSG exists to oversee the implementation of these recommendations. So we asked the Scottish Government and the HPSG to have a seat at their table, because we felt that we needed to be there, because otherwise youth homelessness wouldn't have been addressed in the way that we want it to. And so the HPSG accepted, and they gave us a seat. And in doing so, they also tasked us with developing youth homelessness prevention pathways, especially for 3 groups of people that they believed were at an increased risk. So young people with experience of care, young people coming from the LGBT+ community, and young people with adverse childhood experiences. And so about a year ago, we started one of the probably the biggest project that was about developing the first pathway. And we started developing the pathway for care leavers. So I think it's here, I feel it might be different in other European countries, but here in Scotland, we started with care leavers because they have very specific legal status, and it's not the same as care experienced young people. So here, care leavers are young people who were looked after by the council, so their corporate parent, when they turned 16, but are now going to live independently. So a young person can be a care leaver if he lived with a foster family, in residential care, or supervised at home by a social worker. And here in Scotland, care leavers up to the age of 26 are also eligible for aftercare, which is like advice, guidance, and assistance. So for this pathway, we had to use the word care leaver because they have this very strict legal definition. So in May 2019, we started to work on this pathway, and we wanted to produce guidance and recommendations to support care leavers in a more consistent way across Scotland. So we had a multi-agency working group, and Away Home Scotland coordinated that, but we were lucky enough to have CELSIS, which is the Centre of Excellence for Looked After Children in Scotland. But we also have, of course, the Scottish Government, local authorities, Health and Social Partnership, the Department for Work and Pensions, Children and Homeless Charities. And I think that shows that all these organizations and all those individuals realize that homelessness, it's really a big issue for care leavers. And so we managed to have all these people together in the same room and agree that we had to change something. But also it was quite important to me to see how we managed to work with young people. So we had two groups of young people working with us with experience of care and homelessness. So young people from our national steering group After Streets and from an organization that is called Who Cares Scotland. And they really drove the conversation and they shaped it and they changed it. And whenever we were doing something that they felt was not good enough, they challenged us. And I believe for them, it was extremely hard to do that because you have a room of so-called professionals and you just have to raise your hand saying that what these professionals are proposing is just not good enough. So for me, it was just really a lesson to be learned, and I needed to see that to understand why we need them to be in the same room as us and why we need them to be equal partners, basically. So we also engaged with the independent care review. A couple of years ago, the Scottish government wanted to change the way the care system works in Scotland because many people believe it is broken, that is a postcode lottery. And so the Scottish government set up an independent care review to just ensure that we knew what needed to be changed. And so we wanted to align our work with theirs, just to ensure that our recommendations were in line with also their views around the care system. And so in terms of policy and legislation, Scotland is doing incredibly well when it comes to care leavers, which is why when we started doing this work, we didn't know from where to start because we didn't know if we wanted to propose additional legal duties, what else we needed to do, because the legislation, it's really world leading. So without going too much into details, we have a clear commitment from the Scottish government in the Ending Homelessness plan. They want to end youth homelessness specifically for vulnerable groups, and of course that includes care leavers. We also have Staying Put, and that it's a guidance where all young people are encouraged and enabled to remain in positive care settings until they are ready to move on, and they also have the skills and the support necessary to move on. That's quite a fundamental piece of legislation, and it's really world leading. Unfortunately, it doesn't really get implemented as much, and that's one of the biggest issues that we face around this problem. We also have the Housing Options Protocol, and they exist to assist all corporate parents to ensure that all care leavers have access to appropriate and sustainable accommodation options when they leave care. And that's again to remind that care leavers shouldn't present as homeless in order to receive housing. Unfortunately, we know that that is not the case. And then we have the Children and Young People Act, which is a fundamental piece of legislation, and it sets out all the duties and responsibilities for corporate parents. I put there the United Nations Conventions on the Right of the Child, because that will be incorporated into Scots law, and there are some articles that are really quite relevant to the work that we do. So if we look at the legislation, if we look at the policy, it feels like we are in a really good place and that care leavers are really protected in Scotland. However, if we look at the numbers and at the statistics, we have a completely different picture. And it's really hard to get an accurate picture of the issue, because some sources report that there is a 50% chance of being homeless for caring experienced people. Some other sources say that 30 to 50% of individuals who are homeless could also have experience of care. Now, this picture is not clear because I think that the majority of you know that there are many forms of homelessness. So we have really visible forms of homelessness like rough sleeping, or people staying in temporary accommodation like hostels or bed and breakfast. But we also have hidden homelessness, where people are in informal and unstable housing arrangements, sofa surfing. And these forms of homelessness are more likely to be hidden from services, and so from any official records that we might have. In Scotland, we also have two separate sets of statistics that look about care leavers and homelessness, but neither sets of statistics set out to really understand the nature of the problem of homelessness. In particular, I think it's quite important to highlight, because it's something that we would really like to change, is that these statistics rely on self-declaration of care experience by the applicant. So without an obvious incentive to declaring, it is possible that a significant proportion of people simply don't declare experience of care. So for instance, from last year, 7% of application said that they had experience of care, but 40% were recorded as not known, which means we simply don't know the care background of 40% of people who present as homeless. And then again, these numbers are just about people who physically present as homeless to the local authority. So, you know that all young people face all these additional challenges. They leave care in Scotland, unfortunately, is one of the worst in terms of Europe, because they leave care at 17 on average. And on average, young people in Scotland leave their homes when they're 25. So as you can see, despite having a really, really good legislation and policy and additional treaties that can protect the rights of care leavers, in practice, they're really not a well looked after, a well protected group. So we realized, working together, talking to young people, that for some people, they would be more risk of homelessness when they left care too young, when they had multiple placements, when they really didn't have very strong, healthy relationships. So we knew that we did not want to change the legislation, because if we are not implementing the first piece of legislation that we have, it wouldn't make sense to just add documents that are not going to be implemented. So we just wanted to take some practical steps, some practical things that everyone could implement at their own pace and according to their concerns and their priorities. So at the end of the document, we then had 8 recommendations. They're just 8. So to us, it felt that it could be achieved. Of course, some of them depend on money. Some others depend on changing cultures, changing system, changing structure. So we know that it's just not going to be as easy as it sounds. But the idea of the coalition, the idea of a way home, is just to build on good practices. When we had meetings with other partners, we realized that sometimes people from local authorities wouldn't want to attend meetings, because historically they would go there and people would blame them for all the things that they're doing wrong. And we didn't want to do that. We really need to move away from that. We just need to find what things are working for them, so that we can take those things and go to different local authorities where perhaps they're struggling and propose something that they haven't thought of. And it's really hard for us building that kind of trust. And it's still hard today, but slowly when they start to see that we're more than friends, they're enemies, and it's not our place to shame and blame, then we start to see some change. So these are the recommendations that we put into our pathway. And they're all about empowering young care leavers, ensuring that they have the support and advice available, ensuring that they can rely on healthy, stable relationships, and they don't have to have different people everywhere they go, because that is a massive issue. Ensuring that all corporate parents have specific plans when they set out their priorities and their concerns, and they get reviewed on a cyclical basis with the inspectorate and with other corporate parents and with the Scottish Government. So that's the idea with our pathway. And of course, that work had to be paused due to the pandemic. In April, we were supposed to set up an implementation working group, and that hasn't happened. But we are lucky enough that right now we are having conversations again with the Scottish Government when they and us have enough time and resources to start working on this again. So hopefully that starts soon. But we are also working on our second pathway, and that is going to be for all young people. So at the beginning, the Scottish government tasked us with pathways for young people at risk. And they said caregivers, LGBT plus, ACEs. But then in having conversations with our other partners, in conversations with our young people, we realized that a pathway with LGBT and ACEs wouldn't be very comprehensive. So we changed that to have something that is a little bit more inclusive, so that it really addressed the needs of all young people with a specific focus for vulnerable groups. So we're talking about young people on the edges of care, in conflict with the law, being discharged by hospitals and other institutions, and of course, LGBT and ACEs. So here we aim to issue recommendations that involve specific actions that all the people who are involved in the lives of young people can take. And again, we're talking about families, teachers, youth workers, doctors. And with this pathway, we wish to see more and more work done on prevention, more accessible advice for families, more housing options for young people, and a really strong focus on relationship building. This is one of the most important points. So I believe that this is the value, the pathways represent the practical value of a way home. Anne has explained what the coalition and what this global movement wishes to achieve. And these are some of the ways that we can try to end youth homelessness. And I think for us, it has happened because we really have a combination of three factors. We have a clear commitment by the Scottish government. They really want to address the issue of homelessness. They're really ready to listen and be challenged and be criticized. And I'm really quite surprised to see that despite the problems that we have right now due to COVID-19, the door there is still open, and we continue to have these very open and transparent conversations. We are lucky enough to have a coalition that has terrific partners that I really trust, and everyone now know their role. When I started, that was really, really hard because we put a bunch of third sector organizations, local authorities, all together in the same room. And it took us a while to figure out what we were supposed to do. So I don't know, Anne, if you're there, but I would just say hang in there, because it's just going to improve as soon as you see some results, and as soon as people start seeing the same faces over and over again, you build that trust that is so needed. And lastly, we have managed to really include young people. Okay, maybe manage, it's a big word, because it's really the most challenging aspect of my job. Again, we are not used to do that. Even the language that we use, it's not suited for young people. The first time that they asked for their views on the youth homelessness prevention pathway, 3 out of the 4 words they didn't understand. They come to meetings to the Scottish government where language is a massive barrier. They're volunteers, but they're expected to be working on this issue like if it was a full-time job. So the way we treat young people, it's not really inclusive and fair. And we're trying really hard to change that. And there is a growing movement here in Scotland. So I do have faith that it can change. I continue to do my best to involve them as much as I can, but that is really a big, big challenge. But, it's worth working on it. So I think that these are the most important things that we have done so far. We have also worked on smaller projects. And I think it's quite important to highlight that we keep youth homelessness on the agenda. Wherever we go, it doesn't matter the partners, we talk about youth homelessness, because you have several problems with homelessness. Generally, people think that homelessness is rough sleeping. And even if they think that it's just rough sleeping, they don't see young people rough sleeping. So they don't recognize that that's an issue. And so it's our responsibility to just be knocking on doors to ensure that people realize that it's an actual big issue. And that if we create these sorts of coalitions all around, we can build on trust and work on a common cause. So that is all for me.
Thank you very much, Sabrina. So maybe you could turn your screen back on. So I think something that was quite interesting from both presentations, maybe just to get started in some questions and answers, is do you have any advice on how to meaningfully involve young people in the projects and decision making? Because I think often it can become very tokenistic really, really quickly. And I think something that when we talk about coalition building, we often talk about the other sectors, but not necessarily always the voice of young people. And so do either of you have some suggestions on how to make sure that you don't tokenize young people and that you really get the most out of them? And the second question, or maybe comment for the participants, is there's a questions and answers box. So please feel free to put your questions in there to put to either of the panelists. Because the topic of care leavers has come up quite a lot during this webinar, there's a new report out from End Youth Homelessness Wales. I've shared that on care leavers. I've just shared it in the chat box, so you can feel free to access that. And if you're on our youth mailing list, information that will go out next week. And the last question we have is on the presentations. And so the presentations and the recording will be made available early next week. So put your questions into the box, and in the meantime, we'll hear from Sabrina and Anne on not tokenizing young people.
So if you want, I can give you a real example. When I started Away Home, I was told that we had this group of young people after streets. So I met one of them, and I think my second question was, so tell me about your experience of homelessness, thinking that it was within my rights to ask that. And of course, the young person was polite enough to ask, to answer, and just explain everything about it. And then the more I worked with young people, the more I would go home and think about how no one would ever ask me about my childhood. No one, because I am maybe seen as a professional, because I don't have to disclose my lived experience, whatever that label entails. And so it was really an experience for me. And I think it's a mistake that we all make, unfortunately, sometimes, to include young people in these projects. We have to give them a label and say, if you have experience of homelessness, which means that they get to be seen as homeless. And we have to move away from that, and we should just be happy with the fact that they want to be involved in something. We create an environment that it's safe and open enough, then they can open up and share their experience if they want, but they don't have to be accepted just on the basis of that. And then I think the second aspect, it's about reciprocity. Every time that we ask young people to work in something, they never really get to see how the project is going to end. They don't really understand why we're asking them to participate, to take a survey, to answer questions. And I think it becomes, for them, they just become disillusioned with the system. So instead, if we just ask them random questions, because we do need their views and their thoughts, but if they become partners, so they get to see something from start to end, they just get to see how meaningful the contributions are, and we all become closer to the system, and they don't see the Scottish government or teachers or doctors are distant realities in their lives.
Anne?
Yeah, I completely agree with what Sabrina says. I think for the youth participation, Voice of Youth, we are still more searching as we are still constructing the coalitions. I think it was really recognizable what Sabrina said about talking the language, because during a few Mind the Gap collectives, we invited young people and they say the whole time, but we do not understand what you're talking about. And I think this is a huge challenge and sometimes even a burden to invite them, because if we invite young people, they will not understand us, or we have to adapt our language. It asks an effort. So I feel a lot of people are also afraid to invite young people. And I have one organization in the Mind the Gap, Away Home Antwerp. They are called Betonnen Jeugd, and they work really, they are a youth work organization for young people in homeless situations. And they just always bring young people to the collective without asking, without yeah, without announcing, it is just a normality. And I think what I also, in the support trajectory that we set out for the coalitions, this is also really a huge goal that I have, that it is just, yeah, a normality that you are equal partners and that we do not even think about it. But when I looked at the reality, I have to admit that there is still a big gap. So there is still a lot of work. So I'm also quite curious to hear about youth steering group that is existing in Scotland, for example.
And I think maybe just sticking to that topic, there's kind of a couple of questions that have come in around how we collaborate with young people. And so one question is asking, do you pay young people for their time? Is there a stipend? Is there a per diem? And the second question maybe linked to that is, do either of you use, or the projects use, a code of ethics for how you work with young people?
Do you want me to go first? I see.
Yeah, go. Yeah, go, Sabrina.
So I think for the last one, sometimes whenever we have 4 values that are safety, respect, positive, and fair. So whenever we do anything, we always ask ourselves, is this project safe to run? Are these questions that I'm asking fair? Do I need to know the answer because of my privilege, or do I need to know that because it needs to inform this document? Am I creating a positive and respectful environment? So I think those values are really quite important in shaping any project. And I think I have taken some training, because I think, unfortunately, young people, when you ask them to participate, because they're used to just repeat their experiences, that's their way to be seen, I guess. They come into the room and they just start sharing their experiences because that's what they believe we want them to do. Okay. And it's really hard to change that conversation and just tell them that we're here to do different things. So it's really a conversation that has to come from both ways, unfortunately, because we have created this system. And then the question regarding if we pay them. So in Scotland, if you're interested in that, there is a movement that it's called All In for Change, Away Home and After Streets. We're both part of it. And it's basically a group of people with lived experience of frontline work, and local authorities coming together to work on all issues around homelessness. And all people with lived experience get paid. Now, because we have the welfare system here, some people wouldn't get paid on their bank account because that would create problems with the benefits. So they get paid cash. As for After Streets, it has taken me a while, but I have managed to put aside some money from the Away Home. And Shay, who is our senior member, is going to be a part-time worker for After Streets, which I think it's unbelievably good, because I have talked the talk about including young people, and it's time to do something that is really meaningful, especially because he is involved in absolutely everything. And so at some point, you stop being a volunteer and you become a team member, and we have to recognize and realize that, and just, I think it's really worth that they know that they're part of the team.
Yeah, I think for Flanders, I think we are also really lucky that there exists an organization which is called Cachette. It's also an organization that works for young caregivers, and their employees are also young people with lived experience. So we try to involve them as much as possible also in the Away Home coalitions, and also their volunteers get a compensation. I think the challenge there is that as they are the only organization, they are a lot of time asked. And so sometimes we also ask other youth care organizations to bring young people, but there we have then the challenge, is this then the voice of the young people, and then there is also another way to compensate them. So it is a constant searching where I hope that when we have a webinar in 1 year, I can tell you something more concretely about the experience we have in the different Away Home coalitions. But for the moment, it is, yeah, we are trying hard, but with also a lot of different things we could comment on it, I guess.
There's another question coming in from the youth intervention team in The Hague to ask, have you seen a drop in homelessness in either Antwerp, I guess, or in Scotland here, and perhaps in Canada, from the away home approach? And I'm happy for either of you to answer if you see maybe a decline in the actual numbers. But from the Canadian side, because it has asked in the question, I don't know the statistics on how youth homelessness has dropped in Canada in the last 5 to 6 years, but what I do know is that they have an incredible amount of research, of policy strategies, and of new projects around housing first for youth, for example, and new housing projects for LGBTIQ youth. And so that it's not necessarily always we're absolutely concerned about a statistical drop, but it's kind of the bigger picture that they're looking at in not what we want to do in the next 2 years, but their focus is really on building a much more solid and wider base of research and policies that it will have a much broader impact. But I don't know, can either of you speak to a drop in numbers in your context in Scotland and Belgium? It also might be a bit too soon, particularly for Belgium.
Yeah, it is too soon. And also I think when we look to the work of Away Home Canada, we can only be jealous on their massive research and availability of numbers. In Belgium,
sure.
Unfortunately, this is not at all the case. The research to young homelessness is only actually starting. Of course, there is also already a lot of work done, for example, by Koen Hermans, but to really have concrete numbers, we always have to look also a bit to foreign research. So it is too soon to tell something about this, definitely.
I think in Scotland, for away home, I would agree that we have to look at the bigger picture, which is about really changing the structure and the system, which sometimes is extremely frustrating, especially when you see that there are people that need help now. But also, I think we've seen drops when we really work with specific local authorities. So creating local coalitions, because then you would need someone to actually provide housing accommodations or provide specific services. But when you have local coalitions, that when you start to see a drop, unfortunately, there is a forecast next year here in Scotland that all homeless presentations are going to be up between, if I'm not wrong, 10 and 20%.
Wow. Okay, perfect. Well, I think we're out of time for the moment. There are a few more questions in the chat box, but if you want, when we upload the presentations, you'll also have the contact details to both Sabrina and you have my own contact details. So if you have follow-up questions, please feel free to get in touch. Having worked with Away Home Scotland and over the last 2 or 3 years, they're always more than willing to answer your questions and to support. So I just want to say thank you again to our speakers and for everyone for joining. And if you should get an email in the next week with a link to our website where we'll have all the recordings of the webinars plus presentations available. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Bye.